Here is a strange truth. The United States of America was not born in a single day. It did not begin with one battle or one signature. Its real birth took almost 200 years. Most people think of the 4th of July. They picture fireworks, flags, and a famous piece of paper, but that day was only one moment. The true story is much longer and much messier. This is the story of how America was really born. It is a story of hope and hunger, of freedom and pain. Let us go back, far back, before the flags and the fireworks. Long before any ship arrived, this land was already home. Millions of native people lived here. They had many nations, many languages, and old traditions. They hunted, farmed, and told stories under the same wide sky. And then, around 500 years ago, ships came from Europe. They carried explorers, traders, and dreamers. These men were looking for gold, for land, and for a new life. The two worlds met, and everything began to change. The first lasting English town was called Jamestown. It was built in the year 1607, near a wide river in Virginia. The settlers hoped to find gold and grow rich quickly. Instead, they found a very hard land. The first years were terrible. The water made them sick. Food was short, and many people starved. In one cold winter, most of the settlers died. They called it simply the starving time. But the settlers did not give up. They learned to grow tobacco, a plant that Europe loved. Ships carried the tobacco across the ocean and sold it for good money. Slowly, Jamestown began to survive. More ships arrived every year. More people came, hoping for land of their own. Small farms spread along the rivers. The English were building something new on the edge of a huge and unknown continent. Life was not easy, and it was not always fair. The settlers took land that native people had used for centuries. There was trade, but there was also fear, broken promises, and fighting between the two sides. Then in 1620, a small ship crossed the cold Atlantic. Its name was the Mayflower. On board were families who wanted to pray in their own way. History remembers them as the Pilgrims. The journey was long and dangerous. The sea was rough, and the ship was crowded. After more than 2 months, they finally saw land. They landed far in the north, in a place they named Plymouth. Their first winter was cruel. It was freezing cold, and food was scarce. Almost half of them died before spring. The rest were weak, frightened, and very far from home. Then help came from the native people nearby. They showed the Pilgrims how to plant corn and where to fish. That autumn, the settlers gathered a harvest. They shared a meal that we now remember as Thanksgiving. Year after year, more colonies grew along the coast. In time, there were 13 of them. Each colony was different, with its own towns, its own churches, and its own ideas about how to live. People came for many reasons. Some wanted religious freedom. Some wanted land and a fresh start. Others were poor and hoped simply to eat. Together they built farms, ports, and busy little towns. In the north, families worked small farms and traded by sea. In the south, large farms called plantations grew tobacco, rice, and later cotton. These plantations needed many, many workers to survive. And here we reach the darkest part of the story. To work the plantations, wealthy men bought enslaved people from Africa. Ships carried them across the ocean in chains, packed into terrible crowded holds. These men, women, and children did not choose to come. They were stolen from their homes and sold like property. They worked without pay and without freedom. Their suffering built much of the colony's wealth. So America grew from a mix of things, from hope and hard work, yes, but also from broken promises to native people, and from the cruelty of slavery. This is the whole truth, light and shadow together. For a long time, the colonies felt far from England. A wide ocean lay between them and their king. Letters took months to cross. Slowly, the colonists learned to run many of their own affairs. They built their own local governments. They made many of their own decisions. A new feeling began to grow in their hearts. They were still British, but they were also becoming something different. They were becoming American. Then a great war changed everything. Britain and France fought over land in North America. The war was long and expensive. In the end, Britain won, but it was left with enormous debts to pay. The British king and his government asked a simple question: who should pay for this costly war? Their answer was the colonies. So they created new taxes on the people living across the sea. There was a tax on paper. There was a tax on tea. There were taxes on glass, on paint, and on many everyday things. To the colonists, these new taxes felt deeply unfair. The colonists had no voice in the British Parliament. No one there spoke for them. So they began to shout 3 angry words that would echo through history: no taxation without representation. Anger grew in the streets, especially in the busy port of Boston. People held meetings and wrote furious letters. British soldiers in red coats were sent to keep order. Their presence only made things worse. One cold evening, a crowd gathered around some British soldiers. People shouted and threw snowballs and stones. The frightened soldiers fired their guns. 5 colonists fell dead in the snow. News of the killing spread fast across the colonies. People called it the Boston Massacre. Printers made pictures of it and sold them everywhere. For many colonists, trust in the king was now badly broken. Then came the tax on tea. The colonists were furious. One December night in 1773, a group of men climbed onto 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They were quietly determined to send a message. Some had dressed as native warriors to hide their faces. They broke open the heavy wooden chests of tea. Then they threw all of it into the dark, cold water. We call it the Boston Tea Party. The king was angry. To punish Boston, he closed its busy port and sent even more soldiers. But the punishment did not make the colonists afraid. Instead, it pulled the 13 colonies closer together. Leaders from the colonies met to talk. They gathered in a city called Philadelphia. They did not yet want a war. They only wanted their old rights back. But the distance between them and the king kept growing. Then, one spring morning in 1775, the fighting finally began. British soldiers marched out toward the towns of Lexington and Concord. They wanted to seize hidden weapons and stop the growing rebellion. But the colonists had been warned in the night. Armed farmers were waiting on the village green. A single shot rang out. No one knows for sure who fired it first. The long war had begun. People later called it the shot heard around the world. Ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and workers picked up their muskets. They were not trained soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes and their freedom. The colonies needed a real army and a real leader. They chose a tall, quiet man from Virginia. His name was George Washington. He was calm, brave, and people trusted him deeply. Washington took command of a small, ragged army. His men had few guns, little food, and worn-out boots. Against them stood the mighty British Empire. Almost no one believed the colonists could win. Meanwhile, the leaders in Philadelphia faced a huge decision. Should they simply ask the king to be fairer? Or should they break away completely and form a brand new nation of their own? It was a frightening choice. To rebel against a king was treason. If they failed, they could be hanged. But many now believed there was no way back. The time for half measures was over. A committee was chosen to write down their reasons. The main writer was a young man from Virginia. His name was Thomas Jefferson. He was thoughtful, well-read, and very good with words. Wise old Benjamin Franklin helped him too. Franklin was a printer, a scientist, and a famous thinker. Together, they worked to explain to the whole world why the colonies wanted to be free. Jefferson wrote one line that would never be forgotten. He wrote that all men are created equal. He wrote that they have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These were beautiful and powerful words, yet they did not match the whole reality. Enslaved people were not free. Women could not vote. Native nations were pushed aside. The promise was real, but it was far from finished. On the 4th of July, 1776, the leaders approved the document. It was called the Declaration of Independence. A new country was announced to the world, the United States of America. But words on paper were not enough. Now the colonists had to win their freedom on the battlefield, and the war ahead would be long, bloody, and full of terrible suffering. The early years went badly for Washington. He lost many battles. He lost whole cities. His army was chased across rivers and through the snow. Many soldiers gave up and simply went home. One winter, the army camped at a place called Valley Forge. It was bitterly cold. The men had little food and thin, torn clothing. Many had no shoes at all. Hundreds died from hunger and disease. Yet Washington stayed with his men through it all. He kept them together when everything seemed lost. Slowly, with training and patience, the ragged army grew stronger and more disciplined. Hope did not die. Then came a turning point. In a battle at Saratoga, the Americans won a great victory. They captured a whole British army. This success would change the entire course of the war. Far across the ocean, France had been watching closely. France was Britain's old rival. After Saratoga, the French decided to help the Americans openly with money, ships, weapons, and trained soldiers. This help changed everything. Now the colonists were no longer fighting alone. French gold and French warships arrived. The struggle for American freedom had become a much wider global war. The fighting dragged on for several more hard years. There were victories and defeats on both sides. But slowly, step by step, the tired British army was pushed towards the sea. The final great battle came at a place called Yorktown. Washington's army and the French trapped the British there. Cannons roared for days. British soldiers were surrounded by land and by water with no escape. In 1781, the British commander finally gave up. His soldiers laid down their weapons. As they marched out, a band is said to have played a sad and fitting tune. The world turned upside down. 2 years later, in 1783, the war officially ended. Britain signed a treaty of peace. At last, the king recognized the truth. The United States of America was a free and independent nation. But winning the war was only half of the task. 13 proud colonies now had to become one single country. And at first, they did not work well together at all. Each state acted almost like its own little nation. They argued about money, trade, and power. The young country was weak and disorganized. Some feared the whole grand experiment might soon fall apart. So in 1787, leaders met again in Philadelphia. Through a long, hot summer, they argued and debated. They were trying to build a completely new kind of government, one that had never existed before. It was hard work, full of deep disagreement. Big states argued with small states. North argued with South. But slowly, through compromise, they wrote a plan. They called it the Constitution. The Constitution began with three simple famous words: "We the people." Power would not belong to a king. It would belong, at least in idea, to the citizens of the new nation themselves. The Constitution was not perfect. It made painful compromises, and it still allowed slavery to continue. That deep wound would one day tear the country apart in a terrible civil war. But that is another story. The people needed a first leader they could trust. They turned once again to George Washington. In 1789, he became the very first president of the United States of America. Washington could have held on to power for life. Many great leaders in history had done exactly that. But after 2 terms, he chose to step down and go quietly home to his farm. That choice was rare and remarkable. He showed that in this new country, no single person was above the law. Power would be shared, and it would pass on peacefully. That idea became a precious gift. So this is how America was really born, not in one bright day, but over many long and difficult years. From native lands, brave settlers, and stolen lives. From hope, and also from great pain. It was born from hunger and cold, from anger and courage, from beautiful words and broken promises. It was a nation founded on a dream of freedom that it did not yet fully live. And in truth, that dream is still growing today. Each generation has tried to bring the country a little closer to its own great promise. The story of America was never really finished.